Hi, everyone. It's Master P from the Language of Composition, 3rd edition. Today we're doing another close reading video. This time we're looking at an excerpt from the letter from Birmingham jail by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So, as a reminder, when we are reading closely, we are reading actively, which means that we're trying to not only mentally engage with the text, but also physically engage with it. So we've got our pen, we've got our pencil. We are really trying to identify a lot of different elements. So we're revealing those layers of meaning, and we're trying to get at a better understanding of a writer's strategies and style. Excuse me. So we need our tools. We need our copy of the Language of Composition, 3rd edition. We need our key passage handout. Highlighters are always helpful, but at the very least, and even if you have highlighters, you would need a pen or pencil, something to write with. So when we look at a text, we want to make sure that we understand the rhetorical situation first. That's important because we can't really discuss or analyze the effect or function of the smaller pieces of a text if we don't have an understanding of the larger ideas. So we want to look at the speaker, we want to look at the subject and the audience, and of course we want to look at how all of that is shaped by the larger context. So historical influences, contemporary issues, and then also what's the occasion, what's the specific spark that gave rise to that particular text. So let's talk about the rhetorical situation for this letter from Birmingham jail. Our speaker, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was, of course, a very prominent civil rights leader. He was also a preacher. And in addition to those roles, he was also, of course, a husband and a father. When we're talking about or thinking about speaker, you should go beyond the name and think about the persona. And in other aspects, in other parts of this letter, King certainly speaks as a father. He uses that persona, that part of himself. In this particular passage, we don't see that persona represented. We really see him speaking or drawing upon his knowledge as a preacher. So we'll get to that in a moment. The occasion for the text, it was written while he was in jail after being arrested during a protest. And it was a response to a piece published in a local newspaper by 8 clergymen. This piece was printed publicly and was actually smuggled in to Dr. King while he was in jail. And the clergymen were writing in response to all of the protests and things that were happening. And then King decided that he needed to respond to what these men had said and publicly printed. So his audience would certainly be those clergymen. He writes directly to them, but he knew, and his intention was, that his letter would be published publicly and shared with a larger audience. So yes, his audience was the clergymen, but it was also certainly people of the American South, other civil rights activists, Southern leaders, and everyday citizens in the country. The letter as a whole deals with civil rights, issues related to civil rights, civil disobedience and direct action, and what constitutes a moral duty. So all of those issues are represented in this letter. So our first step is, now that we understand the rhetorical situation, to read this passage for understanding, just to make sure we know what King's talking about, what he's writing about. So I'll give you a moment to do that. I'm going to pause this so that you can just kind of go through and read for that understanding. Okay, so we have an understanding of what King is saying in this particular passage. Now we want to make sure we understand those overall features, right? Because when we analyze, we're looking at how the smaller pieces contribute to the whole, right? So something like purpose, mood, tone, position, all of those elements, how are those larger features, those overall features conveyed through strategies with language? So, as far as purpose is concerned, there are many different answers. I wrote down that King's purpose is to argue that the time is now, right? That, again, kind of going back to what brought this letter on, the clergyman urging King and others to wait. And so King's response is to argue that no, we're done waiting. The time is now for change. And also to, along those lines, King is defending the need for the moral need and the legal need for civil disobedience, for this nonviolent action. The mood in this particular passage is thoughtful and also passionate. His tone, his attitude toward anyone who, and he doesn't name names, but certainly the clergymen are implied, but anyone who works against what the civil rights activists are trying to achieve, he's very condemning of that person or type of person. And alternately, his attitude toward religious leaders, those he references in the passage, and also other people such as John Bunyan, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, we could say, laudatory. His attitude is laudatory. He approves and really sort of celebrates their contributions. His position is that extremism is a matter of perspective and that it's perfectly acceptable if it's extremism for love, right? So that's one way that he flips that term and turns it from something negative, which was used against him, into something positive. So we'll get into that in a minute. So when we are annotating, we're looking to make notations for understanding. We're looking to identify important moments with a writer's style, and we're looking to understand and kind of keep track of how an argument is developed. So those are all really important elements we want to include in our annotations. We can corral that information, collect that information in something like a graphic organizer, and then we can use that tool as a way to help us organize or write our rhetorical analysis. So let's switch over then to our passage and kind of get into that. So there's a lot here. As I said, he references the original letter and or the published piece by the clergyman. And he says, but though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist. So this was something that was kind of someone else categorized him as an extremist. As I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. So here we see, this is sort of the start of his rebuttal, right? And he recasts this concept of an extremist as something positive. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? And look at how this sentence, or really it's a question that doesn't have a question mark. It's a question and a statement, was not. Instead of saying wasn't, which would sound very much like a question, was not is a more formal, more factual. It's the two words being separated implies a non-debatable fact. And it highlights the idea of was not Jesus an extremist for love, right? So we start with was not and end with for love. And then we have this colon and this quotation. So here we see a very clear appeal to King's audience at a couple of levels. Obviously to the clergymen, they're going to recognize this quotation, but also most people in the South would have been very familiar with the Bible as well. You didn't have to be a clergyman to be familiar with the Bible. So that statement would have appealed to a larger audience as well. Okay. Then he repeats. He uses the same strategy. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? So again, same sentence structure. This time, however, he says for justice. So we've got for love, for justice, another quotation. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? So we have this repetition of points that really builds King's argument logically. There is a sense of, not even a sense of, there's logic here. He is presenting example after example, including textual evidence, right? And was not Martin Luther an extremist? Okay, so he shortens it a little bit. It's similar, but it's a little bit shorter. And John Bunyan and Abraham Lincoln. So he's still including this textual evidence, but he shortens it because he's adding to this list and this person, really saying, I have a lot of support on this point. Here's my evidence. This is a logical case I'm trying to make. And then after making this case, he says, so the question is, this is the conclusion, right? He draws us now. He's presented his evidence, and now he's drawing us to the conclusion. It's not whether or not we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. And notice this very purposeful use of the word we, right? Appealing to that larger audience and including himself within it. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? So this part here we're going to look at in just a second, a little more closely in our graphic organizer. So we'll come back to that. And then he comes back to his initial example, okay, probably the most powerful one. And that's another thing too. Look at how he arranges or organizes these different figures. You have Jesus, Amos, Paul, Martin Luther, John Bunyan, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson. So we have these religious figures first, and then we get to these figures from American history. So that's something else to think about. Consider why he organizes the quotations, the evidence in that way. All right, so he comes back to this reference to Jesus, which we could argue is probably the most powerful and persuasive, and certainly when appealing to his particular audience. Let me flip here. Two were extremists for immorality and thus fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, he calls out this name again. It's very purposeful how he calls out the name. Was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, right? This sort of trifecta of aspects, and thereby rose above his environment, which kind of gives that idea, sort of a nod to Christ's resurrection. Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. So this use of the word perhaps softens the tone, King's tone. He's not ordering this to happen, but perhaps suggests, we know what King's position is, but it's a little gentler of a recommendation, right? And certainly we have this building from the South, the nation, and the world. And really that mimics his audience as well. Okay, so let's go back to our graphic organizer. We're going to look for those quotations, those meaningful moments in the text. We want to paraphrase or summarize the quotation, so we put it into our own words so that we're clear on the meaning. We're looking to identify the rhetorical strategy or style element, and then we're looking at the effect or function of the quotation and the rhetoric. Okay, so we've got the quotation that I selected was to look at with you all is when he says, will we be extremists for hate or love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? My paraphrase version is, will your actions demonstrate a hatred toward people or a love toward people? Will you work to keep things the way they are or work to change the wrongs of society? That's how I rephrase that. I noticed King uses parallelism, antithesis, and rhetorical question in that moment. And I said that the effect is that King presents the clergyman or that larger audience with two clear choices. And King implies that maintaining the status quo is evil and that extending justice is love. So the way that I put all of that together into something a little more formal was what I've written here. So I said, King presents two related questions to his audience, which includes not only the clergyman, but the South, the nation, and the world. The inclusion of all people is conveyed through the repeated use of we, and the decision to be made is presented in clear antithetical terms. There is action taken for hate or for love, right? This is the decision. And I'm using that textual evidence. And the arrangement of his next sentence equates the former, for hate, with the preservation of injustice, and the latter, for love, with the extension of justice. This binary choice, right, there's only two, so this binary choice appeals to the religious concepts of good and evil, God and devil, heaven and hell. King is quite literally asking, which side are you on? So the second to last sentence about the binary choice, this is where I'm trying to connect all of these strategies, this moment, all of those strategies and their effect to that whole. Why is King using any of these strategies? What's the larger purpose? So connecting it to his audience in this particular moment. And then the function of what he's doing. Okay. King is such a beautiful rhetorician, and there's always so much to analyze in his writing. This piece really is a model of effective argument, like none other. So hopefully I've demonstrated a way for you to go about analyzing this type of writing. You could, if you were looking at this very small piece, answer this prompt in a well-written essay, analyze the rhetorical strategies used by King to develop his response to being called an extremist, right? That's what we were really trying to get at in this particular passage. So, as always, we congratulate you, the other authors, and myself, and everyone at Bedford, Freeman, and Worth. We congratulate you on your hard work. Thank you for your time today, and fare thee well, young scholars.